I've thought of doing this short review film for a long time, but I found it hard to articulate into words what I wanted to say about Jim Jarmusch's 1995 Western Deadman. It's a film that I associate with a very particular time in my life. Early in my film education, there were a few works I saw that made a big change in not just how I viewed cinema, but how I looked at life. This group of low-budget or independent films I saw made me begin to evaluate what was possible to achieve, not only as an artist, but what was possible to achieve in life. I was younger then, and I couldn't judge what independent cinema and what was Hollywood cinema. I was simply experiencing it all as cinema. For me, at that time, an independent director like George Romero seemed the same as popular directors like Catherine Bigelow, who had survived the move from independent to Hollywood, or even heavyweights like Stanley Kubrick. To me, it was all just cinema. And this was a great introduction to film, as I learned very early as a filmmaker like George Romero once said, you don't need to be in Hollywood to make films. This was a very important time in my life. And Deadman is a film that helped to shape who I am and what I do today to make a living. When a work like this has had such an impact, it's hard to talk about it without gushing, but here goes. From reading interviews with Jarmusch, Deadman seems to come very organically while he was working with cinematographer Robbie Mueller. He has said that the film was not storyboarded, neither was a shot list used. He said while on location scouts, whenever we saw a magnificent view like a postcard type, we would appreciate it, Robbie and I, and then turn our backs and look for our location out of that view. This is perhaps one of the techniques or approaches that gives the film a sense of narrowing to its final vertical framing of Blake in his sea canoe coffin crossing the mirror of water. It seemed to me, watching it in those early days, to be a film that begins in a beautiful yet barren landscape that is beginning to show the scars of civilization. This could be interpreted as an empty page, much like the protagonist William Blake, who begins as an empty vessel and is filled with the wisdom of his journey to death, and finally finds something in himself as he shares an intimate yet wonderful relationship with his friend Nobody. There is a theme of industrialization in the film too, and we must remember that the barren desert and beautiful west of the 1800s that the protagonists travel through would soon be filled with countless factories just like Dickinson's metalworks. Not only is Blake dying, but so too is the Native American culture. Jarmusch has said that he found space in the genre for many themes. This is alluded to when we see a merchant dealing blankets that will poison and kill many of the Native American people with the coming of so-called progress. In an early interview in 1985, Jarmusch said when asked if Westerns had inspired his early wandering characters, that Westerns usually have some character that is drifting or aimless. But at the same time, I think that most Westerns really, thematically, are about death. I would like to make a Western sometime. Taking this into account, one could deduce that Deadman is a film steeped in death. The death of civilization, the coming of a new age killing the previous, and the death of Blake and Nobody, who according to beliefs are leaving this world and heading to the new. Blake himself is an outcast and a lone wanderer. He shares this with Nobody, and the two find each other in this harsh landscape that a character called the train fireman calls earlier in the film, all the way out here in hell. From this dialogue, you could make the argument that we follow Blake and Nobody as they journey through purgatory, though this is not something I dwell on too much. The two friends accompany each other in what I think is one of the most beautiful relationships ever to grace the screen. Two souls from completely different cultures that are brought together by the words of William Blake. I have always seen Dead Man as a movie that has Blake and nobody's relationship at the center of it. They share the weight of the film, and this intense, learning, and loving relationship they share will ultimately end in both of their deaths. We never see nobody die, but it's presumed that he too takes the journey to the next world at the end of the last frame. Perhaps nobody knew this all along. This is just a few thoughts I've had while watching the film again, but the optimistic part of me always hoped that they would join each other again in the spirit world. I was happy when nobody returns in a different century as a character in Jarmusch's later work, Ghost Dog, Way of the Samurai. I had great affection for this character, and that small gesture from Jarmusch gave me a pleasing feeling that nobody's spirit had indeed carried on. A beautiful sentiment, and an example of Jarmusch's true heart and power as a filmmaker. Jarmusch made a comment in a 1996 interview on the relationship that the Trapper family share in the film, played by Iggy Pop, Billy Bob Thornton, and Jared Harris. He said, "It's like here is a trace element of the family unit that has gotten so perverted out here because these guys live out in fucking nowhere. Yet there's some slight thread of the family unit that they've adapted between themselves." I mention this as it might help in explaining my reaction to the scene, which is one of terror, humour, and yet sympathy for the characters in the family who too meet their deaths in the film. I think because they are a humorous family, even a twisted one like this, it adds a depth to the characters. And when they are killed, after squabbling over who gets to murder Blake, the violence carries a sting with it. When Iggy Pop's character of Mother is crawling away in pain after being gut-shot, the violence feels very real, evil and threatening. These people who shared a very strange and complex relationship with each other are now no more. Jarmusch's choice to make these characters into a family who share a strange affection or kinship with each other suffer such a terrible fate shows us that perhaps there might be a little humanity even in the evilest of people. It could be that it is the wilderness out here in hell that has driven these people insane. The characters that Blake meets along the way seem like transients lost in a limbo land where the technology in the next era is a slowly creeping death that will eventually consume the landscape and all that exists in it. This might, of course, just be overthinking, but the destruction of the environment was something that Jarmusch would later return to in another genre-structured film with his environmental zombie movie, The Dead Don't Die, in 2019. These small quirks in the passing characters who frequent Blake and nobody's journey make Colt Wilson, the pursuing devil, plague, death, or the man in black, Dead Man's main antagonist, seem even more inhuman and an embodiment of evil, as he retains none of the human qualities that the other characters have in the film. Lance Henriksen gives a stunning performance in this role, representing everything dark, from the modern-day company henchman to the psychopathic killer who kills his companions in cold blood for talking too much or for being young, stupid, and arrogant. This is such a magnificent performance of a lone killer who has no morals or cares for anything. To me, in Dead Man, he represents the coming death. Talking about Dead Man, we have to mention guitar virtuoso Neil Young's amazing score for the film. The soundtrack album is a work of art in itself, which has Johnny Depp reading poetry over the sound of Neil Young's emotional guitar. It's one of the best soundtracks that I think I've ever heard. I am a little bit biased because I'm a guitarist myself because of Neil Young. At a young age, he was somebody that made me realize how you could express yourself through music. And it really is one of the best scores out there. There are so many elements to talk about in Dead Man. that I think I'd have to go into more videos about it. Just one more thing I'd like to mention is some of the other performances and the cameo roles. This was one of Robert Mitchum's last films. You've got John Hurt in there, who gives this real peculiar radish-like performance, which is just perfect. Gabrielle Byrne, there's so much to talk about. One of my favourite roles is Michael Wincott. He plays this character who's supposed to be one of the bad guys, yet he carries a teddy bear around with him. Jarmusch has talked about Wincott's improvisational style in the movie, and I think Wincott's performance is outstanding. There are these little moments and peculiarities he gives to his character that just make you fall in love with him. I learned, years after first viewing the film when I bought it on Blu-ray, that there was actually a scene shot where you saw Wincott's death in the film. And when I saw this scene, I was glad that it was taken out of the movie because his death scene was so harrowing. I'd kind of fallen in love with this character. And to see Cole Wilson just slay him in cold blood, it felt awful. I don't know why that scene was taken out of the film, but I'm glad it was. I felt like if it was in there, it would have added a darkness to the film that was perhaps a little too much. In conversation about his influences, Jarmusch has said he was inspired by Nicholas Ray, when Ray said, "When you are filming a scene, never think about the other scenes in the film. Don't think about the scene that comes before it or after it. Think only about the scene you are filming. And if you do that, you will have a little collection of jewels that you can put together, but they will work. If you think about the thing as a whole, you are thinking of a diagram or an overview. The most important thing is to be there in that moment, as a navigator and a guide for the actors and the director of photography, and everything that comes together for this moment of the film." This is a beautiful way of experiencing life in a moment, and living and thinking for each passing second. And I think Dead Man is a film that delivers this feeling perfectly. And although the film is about death, it's also a wonderful story about living and experiencing each moment, and living life to its fullest. At the end of the day, what I love about the work is that it's all up for personal interpretation. Jarmusch himself said, "I'm not self-analytical, so I try not to overthink about why I do what I do. I believe much more in intuition. And if you feel it's right, follow that feeling and don't overthink it." In that regard, it's like the work of others I admire, like David Lynch, who to this day still says that no one has gotten what his work means to him, but what they feel or what they say about his work is just as valid. In this way, Dead Man is an experience, and it's personal and different to everyone who watches it. And this is the part that draws me to a lot of Jarmusch's work. He allows you to have your own interpretation and welcomes it. Dead Man is such an inspirational film to me, and it was a huge part of my life and learning about cinema. So hopefully, I haven't gushed emotionally too much about the film, but it's a film I respect so much. So this has been my interpretation and my appreciation for Jim Jarmusch's 1995 Western Dead Man. Thanks for listening.